Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now, let's dive into the stories. He woke up in the middle of the night, feeling his body drenched in cold sweat. The darkness in the room was thick, and even the moonlight that filtered through the window couldn't pierce it. But that wasn't what scared him the most. He couldn't move. Not his hands, not his legs, nothing. Sleep paralysis. The classic condition he'd heard of, but never experienced. Yet, this was something else. He felt watched, and that sensation was worse than anything he had ever known. In the dark, it seemed as though someone or something was standing nearby. The feeling of presence was so real, he began to believe there was, indeed, something in his room. He tried to exhale, attempted to move his fingers, nothing. His body felt like stone, while his mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. The room remained silent, save for the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then, a soft rustling noise. His breath caught in his throat. Was it his own imagination? Or was something else making that sound? As the minutes dragged on, his mind started to play tricks. He could almost hear whispering, low, indecipherable murmurs, right by his ear. He wanted to scream, but his throat wouldn't obey. His eyes darted around the room, and he could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in closer. In the corner of his vision, he saw it. A shadow, dark and long, stretched across the floor, creeping ever so slowly towards him. It was unlike any shadow he'd seen before. It didn't move like a typical shadow, following the contours of the light. No, this one seemed to shift, bending in unnatural angles. It seemed alive. His breath quickened, but still, he couldn't move. He wanted to scream, to call out, but his voice was trapped in his chest, as though some invisible force was holding him still. The shadow crept closer, and then, for the first time, he heard the whisper clearly. Not yet. The words were cold, as if they were spoken from a place of death itself. His heart pounded in his chest, the pressure building in his head, and still, his body refused to cooperate. The shadow stretched its hand, or what appeared to be a hand, and reached for him. He could feel the coldness of its touch before it even made contact, a chill that seeped through his skin and into his bones. He could almost feel the fingers, ghostly and light, brushing against his arm. His pulse raced as the shadow lingered, its form now close enough that he could almost see the faint outline of a face, obscured by the darkness. In a last-ditch effort, he fought against the paralysis, pushing with every ounce of willpower he had. Slowly, agonizingly, his fingers twitched. Then his arm moved. The shadow recoiled, disappearing into the dark corner of the room, but the sensation didn't leave. He could still feel it, that presence, lurking, waiting for him to fall back into sleep. The paralysis lifted, but his heart didn't slow. Every time he tried to close his eyes, the fear returned, clawing at him, reminding him that whatever it wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And this time, it would be waiting. His body still felt heavy as he managed to sit up, his chest tight with anxiety. The shadow was gone, but the air in the room was thick, heavy with a strange, lingering energy. He tried to shake it off, reminding himself that it was just sleep paralysis, nothing more than his brain playing tricks on him during the transition between sleep and wakefulness. But something didn't feel right. It wasn't just the paralyzing fear, it was the silence. The unsettling quiet that hung in the room, as if even the air itself was holding its breath. He reached over to turn on the bedside lamp, but his fingers faltered. The light was already on. It flickered weakly, casting odd shadows on the walls. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at it. When had he turned it on? He didn't remember. In fact, he was sure that the light had been off when he first woke up. His mind raced as he scanned the room again, his gaze now sharper, more frantic. The room, though, seemed normal, too normal. The dresser stood in its usual place. The window was shut, the curtains drawn. But there was one thing out of place, the mirror. It was cracked. It hadn't been cracked before. The hair on his neck stood up as he stood up from the bed and slowly moved towards it. His own reflection stared back at him, distorted by the jagged line cutting through the glass. He stepped closer, inspecting the crack, trying to make sense of it. His reflection seemed to twist, the edges of his face warping unnaturally. His pulse quickened. His reflection wasn't right. A fleeting thought crossed his mind, what if it's not just me here? Then, without warning, the air in the room grew colder. So cold it burned. His breath became visible, swirling in front of him like smoke. A low hum filled his ears, a sound too distant and too familiar. It wasn't in the room, it was inside his head. He spun around, half expecting to see something, someone, behind him. But there was nothing. The door was closed, the window still locked. And yet, the feeling of being watched never left. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, so faint that he could almost convince himself it was his imagination. Leave. The word was sharp, direct. His heart raced, his instinct screaming to run. He backed away from the mirror, but as he did, something caught his eye. A figure, a shadow, just beyond the edge of his vision. His stomach twisted, nausea rising in his throat. He forced himself to turn, fully expecting to see it. But there was nothing there, just the empty room. He exhaled sharply, hands trembling, trying to dismiss the irrational fear that gripped him. Then, a knock. It was soft, but it was there. A sharp tap at the door, followed by a pause, and another tap. His heart stopped. His throat went dry. Who could it be at this hour? No one visited him at night. No one ever knocked like that. He moved toward the door, his feet dragging. Another knock. Closer this time. He swallowed hard and grabbed the doorknob. But before he could turn it, the knocking stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. His fingers tightened around the doorknob, sweat beading on his brow. For a long moment, he stood there, listening. He almost convinced himself to turn back, to ignore it. But something tugged at him, an urge to see. Finally, he opened the door, the creaking hinges too loud in the stillness. The hallway outside was empty, dimly lit by the weak light from the kitchen. But as he glanced down, his stomach lurched. There, on the floor, was something small, something white. A piece of paper. He bent down, hands shaking as he picked it up. Written in red ink were two words. "It's coming." His breath caught in his chest. He looked around, but there was no one. A shiver crawled up his spine. The house felt different now, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The floor beneath his feet felt colder, and the house seemed to hum with an energy that made his skin crawl. He turned back into the room, closing the door behind him with a loud thud. His head was spinning, the words on the paper repeating in his mind. But then, a new sound reached his ears, the faintest of whispers, coming from within the room itself. It was behind him. He turned. There, in the cracked mirror, a new reflection stared back at him. But it wasn't his own. It was something else. A figure. Tall, dark, and distorted. Its features were indistinct, shadowed, but its eyes, they were unmistakable. They were watching him. The reflection's lips moved, and the sound that followed was chilling. "You should have listened." And with that, the lights went out. The darkness swallowed him whole, and for a long moment, he stood frozen, heart hammering in his chest. The sudden silence was deafening. His hand fumbled for the light switch, but when he reached the wall, it was too late. The room was pitch black, and his pulse roared in his ears. He breathed deeply, trying to calm himself, but the weight of the air in the room pressed on his chest like a suffocating force. He could barely make out the faint outline of the door, the corners of the room, his own trembling hands. "Just breathe. It's just your mind playing tricks," he told himself. "This is sleep paralysis, this is just sleep paralysis." But something gnawed at him from the inside, a gnawing awareness that this was different. He wasn't imagining it. The mirror. The whispers. The knock at the door. All of it, real. Then, as if in response to his thoughts, a sound broke through the silence. A soft scuffling noise, like something dragging across the floor. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing. The darkness was absolute. He took another cautious step back toward the door, his fingers brushing along the cold, familiar wall. His thoughts raced. Was it someone playing a prank? But who would do that? And why would they leave that note on the floor? The pieces didn't fit. Then the scuffling noise came again, but this time, it was closer. Much closer. He froze. It was coming from inside the room. He could hear it now, quiet, deliberate footsteps, as if someone or something was slowly moving toward him. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs were paralyzed, frozen in place. The cold feeling, the sensation of being watched, grew unbearable. His skin prickled, the hair on his neck standing on end. Suddenly, the faintest shift of air brushed his skin, an unnatural movement in the room. His breath hitched, and before he could fully react, the door behind him creaked open with a low groan, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The door wasn't open before. He spun around, his eyes darting to the dark hallway beyond, but saw nothing. It was empty. The hallway was as silent and still as the rest of the house. He exhaled shakily, his heart pounding so loud in his chest that it felt as though it would burst. He reached out for the door, his fingers brushing against the cold wood, but as his hand closed around the handle, a voice, quiet and distorted, almost a whisper, came from just beyond the door. "Stay with me." The voice wasn't his own. It was soft, female, cold, distant. And it was unmistakable. He yanked the door open, his hands shaking, but found only the hallway. Empty. Silent. He stepped into the hallway, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The house seemed to grow even darker, as if the shadows were alive, stretching and shifting along the walls. He turned back toward the room and took a hesitant step toward the stairs leading down to the first floor, but as soon as he moved, the light from the kitchen flickered briefly, then went out. He paused. The sound of someone walking, shuffling, echoed from below. No. This wasn't just sleep paralysis anymore. This was something else. He crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound, but as he reached the bottom step, a sudden weight pressed down on his chest. He gasped, his breath caught in his throat as the air grew thick again, colder than it had been before. From the kitchen, the faintest glimmer of light shone through the cracked door. He approached slowly, each step heavier than the last. He could almost taste the coldness in the air, the silence surrounding him. He reached for the handle, but his hand recoiled at the last moment. His mind screamed, but his body wouldn't listen. He turned away, but before he could walk away, the door creaked open. The kitchen was empty, as far as he could see. But something was wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room weren't just dark, they were shifting, twisting, moving as if alive. The refrigerator door stood ajar, the light flickering inside it. And then he saw it. A figure, half visible in the dark corner, moving in his direction. No. No, no, no. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet as he collided with the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure seemed to pause for a moment, its outline dark but unmistakable. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The kitchen door slammed shut, echoing through the house. He stood in the hallway, unable to breathe, the cold sweat pouring down his face. His mind was unraveling. It was just a shadow, he thought, just a trick of the light, just a trick of the mind. But then, the phone rang. He glanced toward the table, where his phone lay, its screen lit up with an unknown number. His heart stopped. He knew he shouldn't pick it up. But his fingers, trembling, reached for it anyway. The voice on the other end was distorted, as if spoken through a veil. "We've been waiting for you." The voice was calm, almost soothing. And then, as if it had all been a dream, the line went dead. For the first time, he truly understood. It wasn't just sleep paralysis. It wasn't just his mind playing tricks. It was real. And it was waiting for him to slip back into sleep. His hand hovered over the phone for a moment longer, still feeling the lingering weight of the voice on the other end. It was too real. He wiped his sweaty palms on his pants and glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m. A time that always seemed to be the peak of unease, but tonight it felt like an omen. The house was too quiet now, the kind of quiet that made every creak and rustle seem louder than it should have. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stay awake, but a part of him was terrified to sleep. Terrified of what would happen if he did. He moved away from the kitchen, hands still shaking as he paced back and forth in the hallway. The phone call, the figure in the kitchen, everything was crashing down on him, pulling him further into a web of confusion and dread. There had to be a logical explanation, he told himself. But what? Maybe it was stress, maybe it was the late hours of his work, maybe it was nothing more than his mind playing cruel tricks. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed tonight. The air felt heavier now, the kind of weight that settled on your chest and wouldn't let you breathe properly. The walls of the house, once comforting, now seemed oppressive. The longer he stood there, the more the house seemed to close in on him. Every crack in the wall, every shadow in the corner, seemed to be waiting for him to make the wrong move. The phone rang again. This time, his reaction was instinctive. He grabbed it, his fingers numb as he brought it to his ear. "Hello?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. But there was no reply. For several long seconds, the line was dead silent. Then, just as he was about to hang up, the voice came again. "You don't understand, do you?" The voice was more than distorted this time, it was suffused with something else, something dark and unfathomable. It was closer now, like it was in the room with him, just beyond his reach. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind racing. "What do you want?" "I told you before. We've been waiting for you." The phone line clicked, and then the call abruptly ended. He stared at the screen for a long moment, the glow from the phone casting eerie shadows across his face. His hand dropped to his side as his mind spun in a chaotic whirl. He tried to steady his thoughts, but it was impossible. Someone, had been waiting for him. But who? And why? A noise from the kitchen broke his train of thought. A loud clink, like metal against the floor. He froze. No. Not again. His heart thudded in his chest as he glanced toward the kitchen, dreading what he might see. The thought of turning the corner and seeing that figure again made his stomach twist. But the silence that followed was deafening. He was alone. Or was he? He edged closer to the kitchen, trying to move quietly, his feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. When he reached the doorway, he hesitated. The light was off, the room as still as it had been moments ago. There was no movement, no figure in the corner. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Then, the clinking noise came again. This time, it was louder. A heavy object being dropped. He stepped into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking beneath him as he moved, but there was no sign of anything out of place. Except for one thing. The refrigerator door was wide open, and inside, the light was on. The chill of the room hit him like a wall, an unnatural cold that seemed to have no source. He stepped closer, half expecting to find something, anything, that would explain the odd feeling of unease in the room. The fridge was filled with the usual, leftovers, fruit, some milk. But there, on the middle shelf, was something strange. A small object wrapped in a cloth. His hand trembled as he reached for it, the edges of his fingers brushing the soft fabric. He pulled it out, unwrapping it carefully, and there, nestled in his palm, was an old photograph. A family photo, faded with age. It was a picture of him. Not a recent photo, but one from years ago, from a time he didn't even remember. It was him as a child, standing beside a woman he didn't recognize. The woman had her arms around him, holding him close, her face obscured by shadows, but her eyes, they were unmistakable. They were the same eyes he had seen in the reflection. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the photo. It couldn't be. This didn't make sense. Suddenly, the kitchen light flickered, and he heard something behind him, a low, guttural sound, like the scraping of metal on metal. He turned quickly, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. There, at the back door, was the silhouette of a person. Dark, motionless, just standing there, watching him. "Who's there?" he demanded, but his voice came out weak, shaky. The figure didn't move. His mind screamed at him to run, to do something, anything, but his body was frozen. The figure seemed to grow larger, its outline becoming clearer as it stepped into the dim light of the kitchen. It was him. But not him. The face was a twisted version of his own, pale and hollowed, the eyes too wide, the smile too sharp. It was as if his reflection had somehow stepped out of the mirror and into the room. "You shouldn't have looked," the figure whispered. It was his voice, but it wasn't. It was wrong. The temperature dropped further, and he felt the walls closing in, the suffocating pressure of the house too much to bear. With a sudden surge of panic, he bolted toward the door, but as his hand reached for the handle, it clicked shut by itself, trapping him inside. The figure stepped closer. "Now, we can finally be together." His breath came in short, panicked bursts as he yanked on the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The weight of the figure behind him, its presence palpable and suffocating, pressed in from all sides. He backed away, his heart hammering so loudly it drowned out the eerie quiet of the room. His mind raced, this couldn't be happening. There had to be a logical explanation, some way out of this madness. But as the figure approached, his feet frozen to the spot, the world around him seemed to blur. The shadows in the corners of the kitchen stretched and flickered, and the walls, once solid and familiar, now felt like they were closing in on him, distorting. Warping as if the house itself was alive. "Who are you?" His voice cracked, barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer immediately. It just stood there, watching him, the distorted version of his face grinning in a way that was both familiar and alien. Then, with a voice colder than ice, it spoke. "You already know." The words hit him like a physical blow. His mind reeled. His thoughts scrambled, trying to make sense of what was happening, but it was like grasping at smoke. The image of the photo, the woman, flashed through his mind again. The reflection, the whispers, the suffocating darkness. "You're not real," he said, more to himself than to the figure. "You can't be." The figure tilted its head slightly, the twisted smile never fading. "I'm as real as you are." He felt the panic rising again, choking him, and the desperation to escape surged in his chest. He ran to the window, pulling at the blinds, only to find the outside world covered in a thick, impenetrable fog. The streetlights beyond the glass flickered and dimmed, as if the world itself was being swallowed by the darkness. There was nowhere to go. No escape. The figure moved again, slowly, deliberately, like a predator closing in on its prey. It was almost close enough now to touch. "You should have stayed asleep," it murmured, its voice low and taunting. "But you woke up. You broke the rule." A sharp, sudden realization hit him. This wasn't just sleep paralysis. This wasn't just his mind cracking under pressure. There was something else, something he had never fully understood before. The house, the nightmares, the feeling of being watched, everything had led to this moment. The house wasn't just a place. It was a threshold. A boundary between the waking world and something darker, something that preyed on those who had the misfortune to fall into its grip. And he had crossed that threshold. He had woken something up. The figure's grin widened, stretching unnaturally as it stepped closer, its presence now so overwhelming that it was hard to breathe. "You don't get to leave." In a blind panic, he spun toward the door again, this time with renewed force, slamming his shoulder against the wood, but it didn't move. The wall seemed to press in on him from all sides, the air thick with something suffocating, oppressive. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the pressure lifted. The room fell silent. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling, his senses overloaded. The figure was gone. The shadows receded. The house, the kitchen, the walls, they all returned to normal, as if nothing had ever happened. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, the echo of the figure's last words ringing in his ears. Was it all just in his head? Had it all been a hallucination, a fevered dream brought on by exhaustion? But the photograph, the voice, everything still felt too real. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, hands shaking. It was a message. "You're still here. You haven't left." He stared at the screen, his heart sinking. It wasn't just a warning. It was a statement. The house was still watching. It had let him think he was free, but the truth was something much worse. The message was signed with a name he didn't recognize. A name from the photo. The woman. His mother. The cold chill of realization hit him hard. She had never left. She had never been gone. And now, it was too late to turn back.